It was a cold December morning in Chicago, the kind where the wind cut through the skin like a knife. The city was alive, traffic moving sluggishly under a pale gray sky. Inside the grand halls of the Cook County Courthouse, Judge Walter Hensley sat behind his polished mahogany desk, staring at the legal documents before him. A man of authority, respected by many, feared by some. He had built a career on justice, sentencing criminals with a firm, steady hand. But that morning, justice had nothing to do with the panic clawing at his chest. His hands trembled as he poured himself a drink. Bourbon, his usual. His thoughts were a storm, clashing and violent. He had spent years hiding his secret, living a double life. On the outside, he was the Honorable Judge Hensley, a devoted husband to his wife, Elaine, and a father to his only child, Abigail. But in the shadows, he was a man with desires, desires that had led him to an open marriage, affairs with both men and women, and ultimately, a disease that could destroy everything. HIV. He had been diagnosed 2 years ago. Elaine didn't know. No one knew. He had been careful. At least, he thought he had been. But then Abigail's body had started changing. She had become moody, withdrawn, and sick in the mornings. At first, he ignored it. But when Elaine found a pregnancy test hidden in their daughter's drawer, his world collapsed. Abigail was only 13. He needed answers. He needed to know who had done this to her, so he had pressed her, demanding the truth. But the truth had shattered him. The father of the unborn child was him. The moment Abigail confessed, he felt the walls closing in. She was scared, her small hands trembling as she begged him not to be angry. She swore she wouldn't tell. She swore it was their secret. But secrets were fragile things, and in a city like Chicago, the weight of one could crush even the most powerful man. And then the realization hit him. If Abigail was pregnant with his child, she might also have HIV. The thought made him dizzy, his head pounding. He had spent years keeping his secret life hidden. If anyone found out, if anyone suspected, his career, his reputation, his entire life would be over. There was only one way out. It wasn't just about Abigail, it was about himself. It was about survival. That night, the Hensley home was quiet. Elaine was away visiting her sister in Michigan, leaving only father and daughter behind. Abigail was in her room, lost in a book, unaware of the decision that had already been made. Walter moved like a man possessed. He had spent all day thinking it through, making sure there was no other way. He retrieved a syringe from his study, one he had taken from the courthouse evidence room weeks ago, a small dose of potassium chloride. Silent, undetectable, effective. When he entered her room, she looked up, her young face lighting up. "Dad?" He forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" She shrugged, setting her book down. "Okay, I guess." He sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I love you, Abby. You know that, right?" She smiled. "I love you too, Daddy." The needle slid into her arm before she could react. Within moments, she was gone. Walter sat there for a long time, staring at her lifeless body, the truth of his crime sinking into his bones. He had done what needed to be done. No one would ever know, or so he thought. The next morning, Elaine returned home earlier than expected. She called for Abigail, but there was no answer. The silence in the house was unsettling. When she climbed the stairs to Abigail's room and found her daughter lying cold and motionless on the bed, a scream tore through the house. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Walter played his role well, acting the part of the devastated father. He held Elaine as she sobbed, his face blank. The doctors declared it a natural death, likely cardiac arrest. After all, there was no sign of trauma, no wounds, nothing suspicious. But someone wasn't convinced. Detective Samuel Carter, a seasoned investigator with the Chicago Police Department, had seen too many cases like this. Something about it didn't sit right with him. 13-year-olds didn't just die in their sleep, and so he started digging. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to uncover a darkness that would shake Chicago to its core. Detective Samuel Carter was no stranger to death. After 25 years with the Chicago Police Department, he had seen it all. Murders made to look like suicides, husbands who buried wives under floorboards, and parents who did unspeakable things to their children. But something about Abigail Hensley's death gnawed at him. Officially, the coroner ruled it as natural causes, cardiac arrest, an anomaly for a girl so young. There were no external injuries, no signs of struggle. It should have been an open and shut case. But Carter wasn't convinced. He stood in the cold December air outside the Hensley home, watching as officers moved in and out of the house. The place was like something out of a magazine, pristine, controlled, a reflection of the man who lived inside it. Judge Walter Hensley, a respected figure in the legal world, a man of order and power. Carter lit a cigarette, his eyes narrowing. He'd met the judge before, briefly in the halls of the courthouse. The man was polished, composed. But when he arrived at the scene earlier that morning, there had been something off about him. His grief had seemed rehearsed, his words too measured. Carter had learned long ago that true grief was messy. It wasn't perfectly timed sobs and controlled devastation. It was raw, unpredictable. And Walter Hensley, he was playing a part. At the precinct, Carter sat at his desk, staring at Abigail's case file. 13 years old, straight-A student, no history of illness. And then, just like that, she was dead. He rubbed his temples and picked up the phone. Dr. Patel, it's Carter. I need a favor. Dr. Ramesh Patel was a veteran medical examiner, someone Carter trusted. What do you need, Sam? I want a second look at Abigail Hensley's autopsy. There was a pause. You think something's off? I know something's off, Patel sighed. I'll take another look, but if you're right, this isn't going to be pretty. Nothing ever was. Later that evening, Carter paid a visit to the Hensley residence. Walter answered the door, his face a mask of carefully placed sorrow. Detective Carter, he said, is there something I can help you with? Carter stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Just a few follow-up questions. Walter led him to the living room. The place was spotless, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. Elaine sat on the couch, eyes red from crying, her hands twisting in her lap. I know this is difficult, Carter said gently, but I have to ask, did Abigail have any medical conditions you were aware of? Elaine shook her head. She was perfectly healthy. Her voice broke, and Walter reached for her hand. What about stress? Anything unusual in her behavior recently? Walter cleared his throat. She was a teenager, detective. Mood swings are normal at that age. Carter studied him. The judge was smooth, his words carefully measured, but something flickered in his eyes, something uneasy. Did Abigail have a boyfriend? Carter asked. Elaine tensed, glancing at Walter. No, Walter said quickly. She was too young for that. Lies. Carter could smell them a mile away. Detective, Walter said, shifting in his chair. My daughter's death was ruled natural. Why are you still investigating? Carter held his gaze. Call it instinct. Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The next morning, Carter got a call from Dr. Patel. His voice was tense. Sam, you were right. The toxicology report was rushed, but I took another look. There was an abnormal level of potassium in her blood. Carter sat up. You're saying she was poisoned? I can't say for sure yet, but it's suspicious. There's no medical reason for those levels to be so high. Carter felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had killed Abigail, and now he had to find out who. Detective Samuel Carter stood outside the Cook County Courthouse, staring up at the grand stone facade. The building was a symbol of justice, yet inside its walls sat a man who had likely committed the ultimate crime. Judge Walter Hensley. Carter had no proof yet, but his gut told him the man was guilty. Abigail Hensley hadn't died of natural causes. She had been poisoned, and the only person who stood to gain from her death was her father. But why? Carter stepped into the courthouse, his shoes echoing against the marble floors. He walked past rows of attorneys, clerks, and reporters until he reached the judge's chambers. He knocked twice before stepping inside. Walter Hensley sat behind his massive desk, his expression unreadable. He looked up, feigning surprise. Detective Carter, he said smoothly. Back so soon? Carter didn't waste time. He closed the door behind him and took a seat. I'm here because new evidence has come up in Abigail's case, he said. Walter's hand twitched, but his face remained composed. I thought the case was closed. It was, Carter said, until I had the toxicology report re-examined. He leaned forward. Turns out Abigail had dangerously high potassium levels in her blood. Too high for it to be natural. A flicker of something crossed Walter's face. Fear, maybe. Then it was gone. That's absurd, Walter said. She wasn't poisoned. I think she was, Carter said. And I think someone in that house knows what happened. Walter sighed, rubbing his temple. Detective, I understand you're doing your job, but my daughter just died. My wife and I are grieving. I don't appreciate these baseless accusations. Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's not baseless, Judge. It's science. Walter met his gaze, a silent battle of wills unfolding. Then after a long pause, he stood. If you have evidence, charge me. Otherwise, get out of my office. Carter didn't move. Tell me something, Judge. When was the last time Abigail saw a doctor? Walter frowned. Why does that matter? Carter pulled out a small notepad. Because I checked her medical records. She hadn't been to a doctor in over a year. No checkups, no visits. That's strange, don't you think? For a young girl, especially one with a father in the legal system? Walter's jaw tightened. We didn't have a reason to take her. Carter nodded. Maybe. Or maybe you didn't want doctors finding something. He stood. I'll be in touch. As he walked out, he could feel Walter's eyes burning into his back. That evening, Carter sat at his desk, going through old case files when his phone rang. He picked it up. Carter, a shaky voice answered. Detective Carter, please. I need to talk to you. Carter frowned. Who is this? The woman on the other end hesitated. Elaine Hensley. Carter's pulse quickened. Judge Hensley's wife? Yes. A deep breath. I can't do this anymore. I need to tell someone the truth. Carter grabbed his notepad. I'm listening. Elaine's voice broke. Abigail was pregnant. Carter went still. She tried to tell me, Elaine whispered, but Walter wouldn't let her. He told her to keep quiet. Carter felt a sharp sting of rage. Who was the father? Silence, then. I don't know. But Walter did. Carter clenched his jaw. Mrs. Hensley, I need you to meet me. Somewhere safe. She hesitated. He can't know. I'll make sure he doesn't. There was a long pause. Then finally she said, Okay, I'll meet you tomorrow. Carter hung up, his mind racing. Abigail was pregnant. Walter had known. And now Elaine was afraid of him. The pieces were falling into place, and soon he would have the truth. Detective Samuel Carter sat in a dimly lit diner on the west side of Chicago, his coffee growing cold as he waited. It was nearly midnight, and the place was mostly empty, except for a lone waitress wiping down the counter. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but Elaine Hensley had not arrived yet. He checked his phone. No missed calls. A creeping sense of unease settled in his chest. Had Walter found out? Had she changed her mind? Then the door creaked open. Elaine Hensley stepped inside, wrapped in a long coat, her face pale. She scanned the room anxiously before spotting Carter. When she sat down across from him, her hands trembled. I don't have much time, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. If Walter finds out I'm here. Carter leaned in. You said Abigail was pregnant. Tell me everything you know. Elaine swallowed hard. She didn't tell me at first. I noticed she had been sick in the mornings, avoiding food she used to love. I thought it was stress, but then she blinked back tears. One night I heard her crying in her room. I went in, and she finally broke down. She told me she was pregnant. Carter frowned. Did she say who the father was? Elaine shook her head. She was scared. Terrified, actually. She looked down at the table. I told her we'd figure it out together, but before I could do anything, Walter found out. Carter's stomach twisted. How did he react? Elaine exhaled shakily. He was furious. I'd never seen him like that before. He locked himself in his office for hours, pacing. The next day, he took Abigail out of school. He told me he was handling it. Carter's jaw clenched. Handling it how? Elaine's eyes brimmed with tears. I don't know, but she was gone for almost 2 days. When she came back, she wasn't the same. A heavy silence hung between them. Carter took a deep breath. Elaine, I need you to be honest with me. Do you think Walter hurt her? Her voice was barely a whisper. I think he did worse. The next morning, Carter drove straight to the medical examiner's office. Dr. Patel was waiting for him. I ran additional tests, he said, handing Carter a file. You're not going to like this. Carter flipped through the pages. Then he stopped. His breath caught in his throat. Abigail was not only pregnant, she had tested positive for HIV. He shut the file, his mind racing. Are you sure? Patel nodded grimly. Absolutely. The virus had already started affecting her immune system. She had to have contracted it months ago. Carter felt cold. He knew what this meant. Walter Hensley had HIV, and if Abigail had it too, there was only one way she could have gotten it. Carter's hands curled into fists. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. Walter wasn't just covering up Abigail's pregnancy, he was covering up his own crime. Carter didn't wait for a warrant. He drove straight to the Hensley house, his heart pounding. He pounded on the door. It took a moment before Walter answered, dressed in a crisp suit as if he had nothing to hide. Detective, Walter said coolly, to what do I owe this? Carter shoved the autopsy report into his chest. Your daughter was pregnant, Judge, and she had HIV. For the first time, Walter's mask slipped. His face paled. That's impossible. Carter stepped forward, his voice like steel. I think you raped your own daughter. I think you got her pregnant, and when she became a liability, you killed her. Walter's face twisted with rage. That's a disgusting accusation. Carter didn't flinch. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is coming out. Elaine already told me what happened. Walter's composure cracked. His hands trembled. Carter took a step closer. You poisoned Abigail because you were afraid. Afraid people would find out what kind of man you really are. Walter let out a hollow laugh. You have no proof. Carter smirked. Not yet, but I will. Walter's eyes darkened. You don't know who you're messing with, Detective. Carter didn't care. He had faced criminals before. But this was personal now. As he walked away, he could feel Walter watching him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Detective Samuel Carter sat in his office, staring at the evidence laid out before him. Autopsy reports, toxicology results, Abigail's school records, and now the most damning piece, the confirmation that she had HIV. It was undeniable now. Walter Hensley had secrets buried so deep that he was willing to kill his own daughter to keep them hidden. But Carter still needed the final piece of the puzzle. How exactly had Walter poisoned her? And more importantly, could he prove it in court? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sergeant Lisa Bennett, his longtime partner, stepped in. You look like hell, she said, dropping a file onto his desk. Carter rubbed his temples. I've been piecing this case together all night. What do you have? She crossed her arms. A reason to put Walter under 24-hour surveillance. Carter sat up. What do you mean? Bennett opened the file, revealing a set of pharmacy records. I pulled prescription histories for the family. Guess what showed up under Walter's name? Carter scanned the page and his blood ran cold. Potassium chloride. It was the same chemical that had been found in Abigail's system at lethal levels. It was used in hospitals for certain medical conditions, but also in lethal injections. Carter slammed the file shut. This is it. This is how he did it. Bennett nodded. And here's the kicker. Walter picked up the prescription a week before Abigail's death. Carter grabbed his phone. We're bringing him in. By the time Carter and Bennett arrived at the courthouse, Walter Hensley was already on edge. His usually pristine suit looked wrinkled, his face pale. He knew the walls were closing in. As Carter approached, Walter raised a hand. Detective, I have nothing more to say to you. Carter smirked. Good, because you can say it to your lawyer instead. Walter's expression barely changed. Do you really think you can make this stick? Carter pulled out the pharmacy records. Potassium chloride, bought a week before your daughter's death, found in her system in lethal amounts. For the first time, Walter looked shaken. Carter leaned in. It's over, Judge. But Walter wasn't done yet. He took a deep breath and straightened his tie. Do you know how many criminals I've put away? Do you know the kind of people who owe me favors? If you push this, Detective, You'll regret it. Carter didn't flinch. I've faced worse men than you, Walter, and they all thought they were untouchable too. Walter's eyes darkened. We'll see. That night, Carter met with Elaine again. This time she had something new. Abigail's diary. She placed it on the table between them, her hands shaking. She wrote everything down. Carter flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. And then he found it. April 14th. Daddy told me that no one can ever know. He says if they do, our family will be ruined. But I'm scared. I don't feel safe anymore. I don't want to do this. April 27th. I think I'm sick. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I'm getting weaker. I need to see a doctor, but Daddy says I can't. May 5th. I don't want this baby. I just want to run away. But where would I go? Who would believe me? Carter's hands clenched into fists. Abigail had been crying for help, and no one had been there to save her. He took a deep breath and turned to Elaine. This is enough. We can charge him. Elaine exhaled in relief. Then do it, before he hurts someone else. Carter nodded. Walter Hensley's reign of terror was over. Tomorrow he would be in handcuffs. The Chicago morning was gray and cold as Detective Samuel Carter and his team arrived at Walter Hensley's house. A squad of uniformed officers stood behind him, ready to make the arrest. Carter's stomach was tight. He had seen powerful men slip through the cracks before, but not this time. He knocked on the door. No answer. Carter signaled to Bennett, who nodded to an officer. Within seconds, the door was forced open and the team rushed inside. The house was eerily silent. Walter Hensley! Carter's voice echoed through the grand living room. No response. Then from upstairs, a single gunshot rang out. Carter sprinted up the stairs, his gun drawn. He reached the master bedroom and kicked the door open. Walter Hensley sat in a leather chair, a pistol in his lap, blood seeping from a gunshot wound in his head. His dead eyes stared at nothing. Carter let out a slow breath. He had expected Walter to fight, to hire the best lawyers to drag this out in court. But in the end, the man had taken the coward's way out. Despite Walter's death, the case wasn't over. The department still needed to prove the full extent of his crimes. That afternoon, Carter met with Dr. Patel for one final update. The autopsy confirms it, Patel said, sliding a report across the table. Abigail's death was caused by a lethal injection of potassium chloride. The pregnancy and HIV diagnosis back up what you suspected. Walter was the father. Carter rubbed his temples. Jesus, Patel hesitated. There's one more thing. Carter looked up. We tested Walter's body. He was in the late stages of HIV. If he hadn't killed himself, the disease would have soon. Carter exhaled. It was ironic. The same secret Walter had killed to protect would have destroyed him anyway. A week later, Carter sat across from Elaine Hensley one last time. I don't know how to feel, she admitted. I should be relieved that he's gone. But Abigail, she's still gone too. Carter nodded. I know. She wiped a tear from her eye. Do you think people will remember her for more than just what he did to her? Carter leaned forward. I think she was brave. I think she tried to fight in the only way she knew how. And I promise you, we won't let her story be forgotten. Elaine nodded, her hands clenched together. Thank you. As she left, Carter sat back and stared out the window. The case was closed, but the weight of it remained. There was no happy ending here, just the truth. And sometimes that was the best justice anyone could get. Detective Samuel Carter stood at the edge of Rose Hill Cemetery, watching as the wind carried loose leaves across the rows of gravestones. Abigail Hensley had been buried a week ago in a small private ceremony. Few had attended, just her mother, a handful of distant relatives, and some of her former classmates. Carter hadn't planned on coming today, but something pulled him here. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need to remind himself why he did this job in the first place. He placed a single white rose on her grave. I'm sorry we couldn't save you, he murmured. A voice behind him made him turn. Elaine Hensley stood there wrapped in a dark coat, her face gaunt from grief. You came, Carter nodded. I had to. Elaine stepped closer. I keep asking myself, if I had been stronger, if I had pushed back against Walter, would Abigail still be alive? Carter exhaled. He had seen too many families torn apart by monsters like Walter Hensley. The blame is his, Elaine. No one else's. She swallowed hard. I don't know how to move forward. Carter reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. She frowned as she opened it. What is this? A scholarship fund. In Abigail's name. Elaine's breath hitched. You did this? Carter shrugged. I pulled some strings. It'll help young girls who need a way out of bad situations. It won't bring her back, but maybe it can stop another Abigail from suffering the same fate. Elaine covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Then she whispered, Thank you. Back at the precinct, Carter placed the Hensley case file into storage. The box was labeled, dated, and shelved alongside hundreds of others. Another monster exposed, another tragedy recorded. Lisa Bennett leaned against the doorway. You good? Carter sighed. Not really, she nodded. Cases like this never leave you. No, he agreed. They don't. Bennett patted his shoulder. Come on, first round's on me. Carter hesitated, then stood. Maybe a drink wouldn't erase what had happened, but it might take the edge off. As they walked out of the station, he glanced at the city skyline. Chicago would move on. The world would keep turning, but he'd never forget. Some cases stay with you forever.